Leon Panetta 2016 lecture series, An America in Renaissance or Decline, the challenges facing a new president. This lecture discusses war, terrorism, and other global threats. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Sylvia Panetta.
Good evening, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to the Carmel Sunset Cultural Center in beautiful Carmel by the Sea for the Leon Panetta 2016 lecture series. We're thrilled to bring the lecture series to Carmel. Not only do we get to present the program in this wonderful theater, but the size of this venue has meant that we've been able to reach out to more individuals and invite them to share in these important discussions. And it has allowed us to host more students for this lecture. By the way, we had over 600 students today. That's an all-time high, and we're very pleased. Leon and I want to extend a special thanks to the City Council of Carmel for inviting us to bring this program to this lovely town for the 2016 season. Thank you, Carmel. As we move ever closer to the presidential elections in November and read headline after headline of insults and bickering rather than thoughtful discussion of issues, events like the Leon Panetta Lecture Series become more and more important. When we go to the polls this fall, we'll perform our most important role as members of our democracy. We'll decide who will lead our great nation. The choice we make will determine whether we will have an America in Renaissance or become a nation in decline. We owe it to future generations to make the most informed choice we can. During the 19th season of the Leon Panetta Lecture Series, we will examine the key challenges facing the next president. We'll look at foreign policy, national security, the economy, political dysfunction, and changes in our society like technology. All topics that will define the course of our republic in the rest of this 21st century. Joining Secretary Panetta on stage this evening will be leading scholars, policy experts, former elected officials, diplomats, respected journalists, and military experts representing both parties in a variety of points of view. Tonight, we begin with war, terrorism, and other global threats. In 2013, when Secretary Panetta returned to the lecture series, Osama bin Laden had been brought to justice. The United States was preparing to bring the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to a close, and there was hope that the Arab Spring would spread democracy throughout the Middle East. Today, ISIS is grabbing more territory in Syria and through social media is recruiting supporters around the globe. Both Iraq and Afghanistan have returned to violent instability. Russia has assumed a newly aggressive stance. China is showing new military strength, and the threat of a catastrophic cyber attack grows every day. Given these serious and varied threats, how can we protect our nation and promote stability around the globe? Whoever is elected will be the nation's commander-in-chief. Will a new president bring a new era of global peace and stability, or will war, unrest, and violence continue to threaten our world? We will pose these questions to three foreign policy experts representing the intelligence, diplomatic, and military communities. Our first guest deployed for both Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. In 2003, during Operation Iraqi Freedom, the division under his command was responsible for the capture of Saddam Hussein. He served as the operational commander of the surge of forces in Iraq and went on to lead the multinational force. As the 38th Chief of Staff of the Army, he commanded more than 1 million servicemen and women. As a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he was a key advisor to Secretary Panetta. Prior to that, he was assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and then primary military advisor to Secretaries of State Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. In total, he has spent more time in Iraq than any other United States general. A graduate of West Point and the Army War College, please welcome a distinguished military officer, General Ray Odierno. Our second guest has 3 decades of experience in international affairs and politics. She was Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs for Secretary of State Warren Christopher and went on to serve as counselor of the State Department as well as Special Advisor and Policy Coordinator on North Korea for President Bill Clinton. As Undersecretary for Political Affairs in the Obama administration, she was the State Department's number 3 official and served as lead negotiator in the successful effort to complete the Iran nuclear agreement. In recognition of her many diplomatic accomplishments, President Barack Obama awarded her the National Security Medal. A graduate of Boston University with a master's from University of Maryland, please welcome a distinguished diplomat, Ambassador Wendy Sherman. Our final guest is a well-respected intelligence expert on national security. Before being elected to the United States Congress in 2000, he was a commissioned officer in the United States Army and later served as an FBI special agent. He was appointed chairman of the House Intelligence Committee in 2011 and was a member of the Powerful Energy and Commerce panel. During that time, he led the Intelligence Committee. America witnessed the operation that brought Osama bin Laden to justice, the debate surrounding the NSA leaks by Edward Snowden, the search for Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, and Russia's annexation of Crimea. He is now a CNN national security commentator and also appears in major print outlets. A distinguished legislator, chairman, and intelligence expert, please welcome Mike Rogers.
Deborah, good to see you. Thank
you. Moderating the discussion is the man who created this lecture series 19 years ago, the chairman of the Panetta Institute, former director of the CIA, and former Secretary of Defense. Please welcome Secretary Leon Panetta. I love you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 19th annual Panetta Lecture Series. We're enjoying this great venue of the Sunset Auditorium. I have to tell you, I may be a little nervous because the last time I was on this stage was when I was 12 years old, and I gave a piano concert here in this place. 1951. I had my parents drive me around the block 3 times before I came in here. I'm sure my parents, wherever they are asking, where the hell did you go wrong? But I'm back on the stage with these distinguished speakers to talk about some very challenging issues that are going to face the next president of the United States. Intelligence reports tell us that we do live in a dangerous world, and perhaps so dangerous that it will challenge the next president in terms of the ability to maintain peace in the world. We're looking at a number of flashpoints. We're fighting ISIS and terrorism. We're dealing with a Middle East that is in chaos. Failed states in Syria and Libya and Yemen. We're dealing with threats from rogue states like Iran and North Korea. We're dealing with what some have called a new chapter in the Cold War with Russia, a much more aggressive Putin than we've seen in the past. And we're dealing with China. We have a huge economic relationship with China, but at the same time, they are making territorial claims in the South China Sea and militarizing some of the islands in that part of the world. And we're also dealing with the new battlefield of the 21st century, which is cyber warfare. Cyber has the potential to literally cripple this country. So there are a huge number of issues that will face the next president of the United States, who I think we have to always remind ourselves is going to be the commander-in-chief of the United States. And we'll have to deal with these issues. And that brings me really to my first question, which is, if a new president were to call you, what would you tell him? Mike?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. There's very few people could get these distinguished guests to come all the way across the country to be here, so we should really thank Sylvia for that. Couldn't have happened without Sylvia. There are so many new threats. You talked about many of them. The militarization of space, the fact that China is trying to push out its territorial waters in the South China Sea, 40% of the world's trade. We have cyber attacks exponentially growing year over year. And we've seen very bad behavior from nation states now using it as a destructive attack, both here in America and around the world. I argue the number one issue we should be concerned about is miscalculation. The fact that you have the North Koreans very aggressively pushing the envelope, certainly on its nuclear weapon program, Iran playing these proxy war efforts around the Middle East. The fact that China is increasing its Navy, should have about 350 ships by 2020. We're going to have about 80. The sheer aggressiveness of Vietnam and Japan and others trying to push back. We're likely to have a maritime skirmish. We're likely to have something happen in space. We're likely to have an event in cyberspace that is maybe not catastrophic, but pretty darn serious. How do we react? How does the President of the United States react to that first crisis? We've got a lot of folks out there we have defense pacts with that we'd have to defend. How are we going to deal with that miscalculation? You know, there's lots of other problems out there. I would argue that's the number one issue for the next president.
I certainly think that Chairman Rogers has laid out what we all think of as the big threats in front of us, but I'd add a couple of things to it. First of all, we are all used to dealing in history with state actors, with countries. We think there are rules of order around how you do that and what the response is. We have lots of examples in our history, but we have a lot of non-state actors, and those non-state actors are not only the terrorists, which we all think of, who aren't governed by any of the rules of the road. They create their own agenda and their own road, and so we have to think about this quite differently than perhaps we've thought about other things. And we have non-state actors and non-state threats like climate change, which aren't governed by a particular country, but are covered by the air that we breathe, the water that we drink. And we know that when there is not enough water, which you all know here quite well, though last night I wondered, when there's not enough water, when we don't have the energy needs of people around the world met. We know that conflict increases. So those transnational threats, whether it's terrorism or climate change or drug trafficking or human trafficking, are all things, refugees, that we all need to deal with. And then the last thing I would say, just like Mike talked about miscalculation, I worry fundamentally about leadership. Whoever is the President of the United States has to really take on the mantle of the fact that the United States of America is the greatest country on the face of the earth. We are the largest and most important economy. There is a rising China, no doubt about it, but we are still, by GDP and by per capita, the largest economy. We have a military that no one else can match. We have an intelligence capability that no one else can match. And we, as Leon pointed out, we are in an era where we cannot not take on the responsibility that is ours. Everywhere we all travel and we all compare notes, people say to us, we are ready to do our part, but America must lead. So this is not a time for the United States to retreat. That doesn't mean we go everywhere and do everything, but it does mean that we do lead. And there are very tough choices to be made for all of the reasons that both Leon and Mike pointed out and that General Odierno knows so well. And we have to not be afraid to understand who we are and what we bring to the world.
Greg? Greatest threat.
I think there's two things that I would say. Is first, as a military leader, I worry about the multitude of threats that we face, and the potential to face them simultaneously is a new challenge for us. And the fact that you might have one threat and one adversary try to take advantage of action going on in another place, which leads to potential miscalculation. The second thing I fear most is this idea of isolationism and disengagement from the rest of the world. I think it's incredibly dangerous for us at this time to disengage ourselves. As was mentioned by the ambassador, there's never been a more important time that I believe we need U.S. leadership around the world. And if we decide to disengage and isolate ourselves, it will frankly make the problems worse, not better. And it will ultimately cause us potentially in the future to have to respond in a much larger way than we probably would like to. So in my mind, it's important to stay engaged. It's important to have strong leadership. And it's important for us to have the capability to conduct simultaneous operations on different continents, because I think that could be a requirement here in the near future.
All right, let's turn to some of these specific threats. ISIS. This September, it'll be 15 years since 9/11. 15 years of fighting this war on terrorism. We clearly have had some successes. We've decimated al-Qaeda's key leadership in Pakistan. We took down bin Laden. And we have prevented another 9/11 type attack. But clearly terrorism has metastasized. And we see it with ISIS, we see it with Boko Haram, al-Shabaab, and other elements of al-Qaeda. President of the United States has said that our mission should be to defeat ISIS. We have conducted airstrikes. We have special forces that have been deployed there. We have trainers and advisors that are trying to train the Iraqis and others to be able to fight ISIS and move them out of this territory. We're dealing with a threat now that is a quasi-state. They own a huge amount of territory in that part of the world. And they have conducted attacks in Paris, in San Bernardino. Are we defeating ISIS? And if not, what is the strategy to get that accomplished?
I would say first that we have sustained and reduced their capabilities and their ability to expand in claiming territory within Iraq and Syria. But I believe ISIS, I call as a symptom. It's a symptom of places where you have failed governments, failing governments, ungoverned territory. And so in order to defeat a network of capability that is starting to spread to North Africa and other areas, you need a network of capabilities to defeat that threat. So I don't believe we can defeat it with air power alone, and I think there's limits to military power as well. But I believe we need to use a combination of ground capability, of coalition forces led by U.S. capability, along with air power. We have to go after their money. We have to be able to cut off their network of funding, We have to challenge them in social media and on the internet and make it very difficult for them to continue to recruit. We need to build a coalition of capability that will help us to solve the problem once we defeat them, because I believe we will on the ground, is then what comes next? What comes after the day after? What is the governance solution that will allow us to sustain long-term impact? I am scarred by this a little bit because I would argue that in 2010 in Iraq was peaceful, Iraq was growing economically, but what we didn't have is a plan to govern after we left. And once we left, the government failed, and we then went back into this violent cycle. And if we don't have a plan to solve that, this time we'll run the same cycle. But U.S. can't do it alone. It's got to be a coalition of Arab, NATO, all countries involved. It's got to be a simultaneous network of activity that challenges them on several different fronts. And by doing this, I think we can defeat them. It is not a short-term answer. It's going to take time. And we have to be patient enough and have the willpower to do this, because if we don't, ultimately it will end up inside of our shores.
Wendy?
I think I'd build on what the General has said. Governance is a staggeringly difficult issue. I think everybody here probably recalls the days when we talked about nation building and we said that wasn't such a good idea because we were laying all the responsibility on us to do something that countries needed to learn how to do for themselves. We've had times when we've run anti-corruption campaigns, or one campaign or another. We've talked about how to build the institutions of democracy. All of these are pieces of a puzzle, but it is a very complex puzzle, and it does not happen over time. We didn't grow our own nation in a decade. We are still perfecting our nation, and we will for some time to come. But we've learned something about how to help countries build their own competence, their own capability, take ownership for their governance, because once you are in a country, once you have held territory, unless you have a governance structure to put in, you're going to find yourself, as the General said, right back to the beginning. So on top of dealing with recruitment, financing, the actual military operations to take out terrorists, which we have to do, to help countries really solidify their gains, they have to hold that territory, and then they have to put governance structures in place that can be sustained over time. Otherwise, we will have ungoverned space, we will have safe havens, and we'll be back to the beginning again. It's a tough, complex operation that will take a very long time.
Mike?
You know, one of the things I think we should learn both by mistakes of decisions that we make that have consequences and decisions we don't make that also have consequences. And we ought to take a total look at the last really 16 years and see where those decisions made had a positive impact or negative impact, and same without making decisions. Our decisions that we could have taken 6 years ago against ISIS building up in eastern Syria, the options were never great, but they were better. And then 5 years, they were starting to deteriorate. 4 years, deteriorate. 3 years, deteriorate, till we find ourselves now where there's just not a lot of great options. But if you think about how far they've come, they're operational in about 11 countries, operating in about 24 countries, ISIS as we know them today. There is an FBI field investigation in all 50 states into ISIS activities. So that means every FBI office in the country is working an ISIS case of somebody either sympathizing, raising money, or, God forbid, engaged in activities worse than that. And so that's a problem. And the narrative, we've never been able to change the narrative. And my argument was early on, and I completely agree with both the General and the Ambassador, but we also need to disrupt their narrative. Their narrative is, they've been at it for a long time. Guess what? We're winning. We're still here. We've chased some of the folks out. Canada left. They're not even doing it anymore, bombing anymore. And so that narrative, they use that very effectively. It was, it's VHS tape of Al-Qaeda, versus, fancy new Twitter and social media campaign on ISIS. And the difference is incredible. So they have full operations, 90,000 tweets a day, recruiting, messaging, trying to make sure that the people around the world who are sympathetic to their cause understand that they believe they're winning. That's a huge problem for us. So I argue if in the short term, we have to do something that changes the narrative. And I agree, this is not the job for big conventional military forces. We're going to have to rebuild some of the coalition efforts, but you have to do something to change the narrative. And there have been some things. So, matter of fact, today they announced they got the Chechen, which is a very symbolic senior leader in the cause. He was actually one of their better combatant leaders on the ground in Syria. And he was an ISIS sympathizer. Taking him off the battlefield, good day, strike one for the world and a good day for America, good day for civilization. But it has to be more than that. We need to start telling the rest of the folks who are still showing up to fight that it's a losing cause, that the United States and our Western allies and our Middle Eastern allies are coming together to change that outcome.
Let me pick up on what you just said, because, obviously, learning from 9/11, what happened was we really developed our capability to track the terrorists, to be able to follow their communications, to know when they were putting a potential threat together and be able to get that kind of information. Now, obviously, we're dealing with a group that are very good on social media, but we've run into this problem between Apple and the FBI, in which the information that the FBI is trying to get from one of the cell phones that was used by one of the terrorists involves having to break the encryption and get that information. Apple has now challenged that, said it jeopardizes their business and the rights of privacy of all those that are using those kinds of iPhones. How do we deal with this challenge? Because yes, we have to protect our freedoms, but we also have to protect our security. How do we find that balance that allows us to be able to protect Americans from the potential of another attack?
Yeah. So I'm a former FBI agent. My first reaction was, well, this shouldn't be an issue. Apple should give the phone so that the FBI can get it. I said earlier, much to, I think I'm still in trouble with the tweets I'm getting now, is that as an old FBI agent, you want to screw the gun in the guy's ear and say, give me the phone and give me the information. I can say that. I'm not in Congress anymore. That's not the right answer either. And so one of the things that has been really interesting to watch is that it's a new age of American national security. Some of our strongest allies, their economics, their economic relationships are now separating a little bit from their national security interests. And the best case for that, and there's others, is Australia. They are locked at the hip with us. They are some of our best partners in the world on intelligence and military planning and diplomacy. They have never wavered, not once. And the problem now is that their economics are changing, even a place like South China Sea, because about 27% of their GDP is exports to China. So sometimes when you're talking about making big national security decisions, they have to have that conversation about, yes, I want to push back on China too, but there's a difference. I look at this as the same issue. The same issue that why we have around the world and thump on people, but to protect goods and services of the United States delivered anywhere in the world unmolested. And it was a stroke of genius. We became steadily over time the biggest, best economy in the world, and really nobody messes with us along the way. And if you have any doubt, ask the Somali pirates off the coast. They had a small little Navy incursion, didn't work out all that well for them. And it sent a very strong signal that we will not have our goods and services molested anywhere in the world. So we have already decided that we can join our national security purpose and for economic purposes. So I think we solve this issue this way, because I think it's important that Apple have the ability and opportunity to continue to sell and be a great American company and sell in China and have an encrypted option there, sell in Iran to have an encrypted option there, so the government doesn't abuse the people in the country for expressing their discomfort with the government. Same with Russia. So now how do we align our economic interests with our security interests? I think this can be done. I think it's going to be pretty difficult. But what we're trying to do is find the right people who can find the right technology. Technology today is we can't do it, we won't do it, we're not a part of it. Part of it is this, Ambassador and I have had many conversations about the ramping up, the FBI ramping up the rhetoric, and I think even as an FBI, I think it was unfortunate that we're having this fight in the front pages of the newspapers. A lot of this could have been worked out in other better suited places for a better outcome probably, but we are where we are. So can we find the right technology that answers the needs of a company like Apple and meets our national security needs, meaning third-party encrypted keys at a very high level that regenerate on each use. I think there's companies out there that can do this. Can we translate that so everybody comes out of this where you don't have to say I'm balancing one or the other, I'm sacrificing a little of that to get a little of that. I think you can do this in a way where you don't have to sacrifice anything. That Fourth Amendment to the Constitution is the guidepost for FBI agents to go into the court to get a warrant to get into someone's house to read their papers, which was the original intent of this. How does the government go about doing that legally and appropriately with oversight? That's really what we're looking for here. It's not that they should never do it. It's not you can do anything you want, the government can't look. No, here's your rights, and by the way, if the government needs to peek around your curtain, here's how they have to do it. This is a very high standard they have to meet. I think we can do both, and we're going to have to answer this question, but we should do it soon rather than later, and we ought to try to come together. Right now, everybody's in their neutral corners, and no one's having an honest intellectual debate about this. We need to get to that debate.
Wendy?
I think two things. One is that a lot of times problems are best solved quietly. And that's just antithetical to the social media world that we live in and the 24/7 media world we live in. But if you look at 4 very tough cases of diplomacy, Cuba, Middle East peace, Iran, and North Korea, the 2 that have had some success, and we can debate this, just like up on Capitol Hill, to get past some of the partisan gridlock around national security, when people have been able to quietly have discussions, they occasionally even can get something done. So that's point 1. And the second I would say is we are in a whole new world. Not only in the Apple situation, but we are having changes in our economy that are phenomenal. Technology is going to play an essential part of everything in our world. Cell phones are used in the developing world to do everything because there aren't any other options. So all financial data is on those cell phones. We have disrupted new innovations, what are called disruptive, like Uber and Amazon, that are totally different economic models. And they will create new security concerns. They will. And so the person who's the next president of the United States has to be able to imagine now what that world is going to be like so that we have the regulatory and legal frameworks that we need. I probably spent more hours in the Situation Room discussing cybersecurity and the right and left margins of the use of cyber as both an offensive and as a defensive weapon than almost anything else I did, because it's very complicated, it's very difficult, but it is very essential.
Ray?
I'll just quickly add, this idea of encrypted communications is an incredibly complex issue, and the ambassador just discussed the economic problem with encrypted communications, or the reasons we need encrypted communications. From a military perspective, you know, it's not only really how the encrypted communication issue inside the United States, it's really internationally. Yeah. And how as we're conducting operations around the world, do we get access to encrypted communications for us to be able to gain the intelligence necessary for us to do the things we need to do? And so what's not happened yet is we have not had the discussion in international law on this issue. We really have not had a good discussion on U.S. law on this issue, and it's happening. And so the national security implications are significant. And I guess the only positive thing that I would bring from the Apple FBI is that it is bringing it to the attention of these are some of the problems that we're just beginning to face in this area, and we've got to solve them. And whether it takes legislative change, policy change, and then as Congressman Rogers said, Chairman Rogers said, there's probably technical solutions as well. But we have to get after this because, in my opinion, it's going to directly affect our national security if we don't solve the problem.
Wendy, let me ask you about moving on to Syria. Terrible civil war in Syria. 250,000 people have been killed. Millions have become refugees. It's a proxy war, both in terms of regional and world powers. President said Assad should be removed, and now everybody's involved in this fight. Russians, Iran, Hezbollah, everybody's shooting at each other. Do we have to make a choice between fighting Assad, removing Assad, and fighting ISIS? Some have suggested that we do, number one. And number two, could you comment on Russia's decision today, Putin's decision to begin withdrawing? What's the motivation behind that?
So first of all, on Assad, the reason why Assad needs to go, whether that is tomorrow or perhaps 18 months from now, which is the timetable in the UN Security Council resolution, that within 18 months there would be some kind of an election to create a transitional governing authority, is because Assad has lost credibility with his own people, and because the Gulf Arab states will never stop the proxy war in Syria if Assad remains. So even if you agreed with Russia and Iran that Assad should stay because ISIL is more important, we need to fight ISIL, it won't happen. Because although the Gulf Arab states have agreed to having this peace negotiation, as you pointed out, it is a proxy war. It is not just an internal civil war. And they're not going to let go because the stakes of Iran's engagement in the Middle East is profound for Sunni Arabs, because there's an underlying Sunni-Shia conflict that is going on, one of many conflicts going on, but that is certainly one of the fundamental ones. So Assad leaving is not just because the President of the United States said he must leave, or because he used chemical weapons against his own people, which certainly sort of undermines his contract with protecting his own citizens, but because the civil war will never end, because it's a proxy war for others as well. Now, the good news, before I get to the Russian news, which I'm not sure is good or bad, but I'll explain what I think it is that the ceasefire that was recently negotiated has held longer and better than most people ever thought it had a chance to. And that's crucial because people are getting aid because, as I think you all saw, Assad used starvation as a weapon of war. And literally, entire villages and towns were starved to death, literally. So that is a good thing. And today, Staffan de Mistura, the UN envoy, began the next round of peace negotiations. Their proximity talks. That means nobody's in the same room together. He talks with one side in one room, and then he goes to the next room and talks to the other side, and then he goes back and forth, because putting them all in the room together, they would just scream and yell and it would never get anywhere. So he plays the negotiator and the broker and tries to edge people towards a place where ultimately they can be in a room together. But today, as those peace talks started, Putin, President Putin of Russia, said, we're going to begin to withdraw our forces out of Syria. Now, the fact that it happened today is, of course, no coincidence. And I think most analysts believe that he's trying to nudge the Syrian regime to negotiate seriously. It probably is very costly for Russia to have its troops there in the way it has, and their economy is in very bad shape. Three, he probably is trying to affect the price of oil in some way by withdrawing from Syria and saying the world is going to calm down and we're going to solve the crude oil supply and try to stabilize prices. And he still has a naval port in Syria. He still has an Air Force base in Syria. He still has a relationship with Iran and through Iran with Hezbollah. And he may still have military advisors. So it is probably a good news, bad news story. And I'm not sure any of us know exactly how it's going to play out, but Putin is a very tactically smart person. And I think this says to the world, I am a big, powerful player because I have done this today, and I have a big seat at this table in this peace negotiation. I'm doing all the right things, and so I come to this negotiation with more power. And at the end of the day, if the United States and Russia agree, it puts a lot of pressure on everybody else.
Ray, what's your solution to the Syria situation?
Well, I think, first off, the ambassador outlined it incredibly well. The one thing that I would add is, as she stated at the end, is that President Putin wants a say in the outcome of whatever this transitional government is, because Syria is deemed as important to the Russians for the warm water port that they have, and, oh, by the way, to maintain influence in the Middle East. And so I think that's why you're seeing him maneuver now, again, because I believe he wants to be one of the very strong voices in how this turns out. But I would not mistake this for peace coming to Syria and Iraq.
Good point.
As was mentioned, I would just tell you this is what you're seeing play out in Syria, what you're seeing play out in Iraq, what you're seeing play out in Yemen is a symptom of the underlying conflict between, some people call it Arab Persians, I tend to call it Sunni Shia, where you have this competition for control and hegemony of the region led by Saudi Arabia on the Sunni side, Iran on the Shia side, and this is going to continue to play out. And what you've seen with groups like ISIS is they are opportunists taking advantage of the failed and failing governments and the ungoverned territories, and they will continue to do that. And so this is just the beginning. At least if we can solve the problem of who is going to be the transitional government in Syria, we then can focus on ISIS. Because right now it's a bit confusing, because the Russians said they were going to come in to really go after ISIS, and we all know they really have not. The majority of the work they've done has been against the fighters fighting against the Assad government. And so it is really worsening the situation overall, although it's helping to solve the immediate problem of at least it started getting to ceasefire in Syria. So I guess what I'm saying is incredibly complex, no easy solutions. I believe there's a lot of political maneuvering going on to ensure that they can gain influence on the outcomes and to continue to play a key role in the Middle East. Russia wants to increase its international profile. And we can get into it more, but that's, I believe, is also related to what they do in Ukraine and other places as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. The one difference I have, if we're really going to get an effort here, and I always argue you need to set up your diplomats to be successful, is with Russia in the game, even at the negotiation table, our Sunni allies in the region go crazy. Why? Because he has picked his team. He said, Iran, the Shias, my team. Hezbollah, my team. And he went in, I'm not sure anyone was really surprised that he went in to protect his team. So when he was bombing American allied rebels, certainly didn't shock me because they were against Assad. So he was fortifying, I think, his position to make sure that Assad's troops had the chance to kind of shake themselves off and reposition themselves, which they did. Get some Hezbollah troops off the battlefield. That was causing some political angst from Iran. And Hezbollah was, they were suffering casualties in a way they hadn't done really ever in their history. That was starting to create problems. He gave them space that I think space that they badly needed. My argument is if we're going to be for Sunnis beating ISIS a Sunni problem, we needed to be more committed to that effort, to that coalition. And yes, it was going to be some tough days for that coalition to be up and operating in eastern Syria, but we never really did that. And so what you'll do when I talk, and I'm sure you have these experiences as well, when you talk to our Sunni Arab partners in the region, they just don't trust us. They don't understand what we're doing. They say, well, if we're your friend, if we are your allies in the region, why are you doing that? Why are you in bed with the Russians? They're trying to kill us. They're helping kill us. And I think we missed the boat by saying, well, Russia's a big important player and we're just going to negotiate with them. It misses this piece of our Sunni Arab partners. And I don't think we'll ever get this right until we fix that problem. And what that looks like could take a couple of different forms, but we're going to have to fix that problem. And then I think you could get the credibility to negotiate with some of these factions in Syria to actually negotiate a ceasefire. They don't like it. They don't want it. They say you're negotiating with people who slaughtered our families in my home, right? That's a powerful place for them to be. We have to fix that attitude.
Okay, before we turn to questions from the audience, let me just ask Wendy, you have, in your experience at the State Department, negotiated with North Korea You've been at the table during those negotiations, and then you obviously led the negotiations in dealing with Iran. What are the similarities and differences in dealing with North Korea and then dealing with Iran?
Every situation is sui generis. There are things to be learned from each, but they're quite different. I dealt with North Korea at the end of the Clinton administration. I didn't negotiate the agreed framework, which ensured that Ambassador Bob Gallucci did, which ensured that for the entire length of the Clinton administration, not one additional ounce of plutonium was created in North Korea. But we were concerned that North Korea was developing ballistic missile technology that would give them a delivery system if they ever did, in fact, get to a nuclear weapon. There wasn't a nuclear weapon yet at that time. Kim Jong-il, the father of the current leader, with whom I met for 12 hours with Secretary Albright, had his own view of the world. And I joke that North Korea was a cult, is a cult, more than a country. Iran is a country, but North Korea is more like a cult, led by this leader who is really seen as a deity, is seen as godlike in his country, and all things flow from him, all things. And Kim Jong-il was brutal, but he was transactional. One could deal with him in return. We ended the Clinton administration without being able to make any kind of a deal, in part because it was the year we were having this little bit of a presidential problem. We thought we ought to brief the incoming administration, except November happened.
You didn't have an administration.
And we didn't have an administration. It wasn't until middle of December that the Supreme Court decided that election. So we couldn't bring this to closure in any way. Iran is a country. Its borders are open to Europe, even if they're not open to us. People are on the internet, even though there is censorship. They get around it. They see what people have. They see that the country next door to them, Turkey, which is an Islamic country, has all these great things, has all this commerce, and why can't they have it too? And they have been engaging with the world trying to resolve this for some time. Most people think of Iran as a monolith, all led by the supreme leader, and everybody just salutes and does what he says. That's not true. They have a modulus. They decide who gets to run for the modulus, so it's not a real, true democracy. But there are elections, there are politics. I only half-jokingly say there are hardliners and hardliners. There aren't moderates in the sense that we would think of moderates, but when President Rouhani was elected, he was more moderate than Ahmadinejad, which isn't hard to do. It did open some space, and the international sanctions that were put on by the world, and with tremendous leadership from the United States Congress, brought Iran to the negotiating table. It never stopped their nuclear program. Sanctions never stopped their nuclear program from the early 2000s until the time we got into serious negotiations. Iran went from 164 centrifuges to 19,000 centrifuges. So sanctions never stopped their program, but it did get them to the negotiating table, and the rest of the story is now history.
We'll have more to ask on that. Let me take a moment to recognize, if I can, our question review team. They're the people that are responsible for selecting the questions that are being presented to our speakers. And if you'll hold your applause, and I'll introduce the entire group. Julie Copeland, who's city editor of the Santa Cruz Sentinel. Fran Gaver, who's a veteran question review team member. Doug McKnight, reporter for KAZU. And Don Miller, who is the executive editor of the Monterey Herald. If you will thank them, I would appreciate that. We had a great student program, as Sylvia pointed out, with the largest number of students we've ever had. We have a group of students that are representing those who attended that program. And at this time, I would like all of the students in attendance to stand, and please remain standing until I recognize each of your schools. Thank you very much, guys.
All right.
The schools, these students are from the California Maritime Academy, Defense Language Institute, Middlebury Institute of International Studies, the Monterey Coast Preparatory School, Navy Postgraduate School, San Jose State University. All of those are represented. Thank you very much. Okay, let's turn to the deal on Iran. First question. Now that we have drawn the line in the sand with the Iran nuke deal, what should our response be if they break the deal? What were the calculations for potential failures going into the deal?
Well, this will be interesting. I'll respond, and then I'm sure the chairman will have something to say about this. It's very interesting sitting here next to Chairman Rogers, now that he's no longer in Congress and I'm no longer in the administration. It's very nice. We were very nice when we were in our roles, too. Look, this deal is not and never was about trust. There is tremendous mistrust between our countries. We mistrust the Iranians, they mistrust us. The enmity goes back not only to the hostages that were held for so many days in 1979, but all the way back to the 50s when we worked with British intelligence to knock off their prime minister after he nationalized the oil industry and made the British go crazy. So the mistrust is very deep and very profound. The deal was about monitoring and verification. And the monitoring and verification mechanisms that have been put in place are the most extensive that have ever been in place forever. And as I think most people know here, this negotiation began bilaterally in secret, then was brought into the P5+1. That's the 5 members of the permanent members of the Security Council, who happen to be the 5 members of the nuclear club. That's why they are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany and the European Union. And it took us 2 years to do this because it is incredibly complicated and because all of the devil is in the details. So I believe that we have an agreement that should ensure that Iran never develops a nuclear weapon, because we have cut off all the pathways to fissile material. That's what's needed to create the actual weapon itself, either highly enriched uranium or weapons-grade plutonium, or a covert supply chain to be able to do that, and we've cut them all off. The International Atomic Energy Agency has said that Iran has complied with everything they were supposed to do to get us to lift, not to terminate, but to suspend, in essence, our sanctions and the international sanctions. So far, since January, when we had implementation day, Iran has done what it was supposed to do, and that was a significant reduction in the number of centrifuges, the amount of stockpile they can have, the level of enrichment they can do, access to any site where we have suspicions, including military sites. And all of these things are really quite locked in with all kinds of technology used to know what they're doing. So let's say they cheat. In my view, we have at least two things that we can do, 3 things. One, we can find out what the hell they were doing, and we had an interim step, an interim deal, a first step, so we'd have time to negotiate the comprehensive deal. And during that time, some things went wrong, and we went to them and we found out some errant things had happened by people who were either trying to sabotage the deal or just screwed up, and we got them fixed. So the first step would be diplomatically and that's why we put in a 30-day review period when there's disagreement, to see whether whatever the problem is can be fixed. But if it is egregious, if it is significant, if we determine it's significant, even if nobody else does, we can immediately go to the UN Security Council, and the way the vote is taken at the Security Council, we can use our veto to ensure that all of the multilateral sanctions snap back immediately. And we, of course, because we have only suspended the sanctions in the United States, the President of the United States can slap them back on whenever. There is no doubt it will be harder in the sense that lots of countries will have come in and started commercial ventures with Iran, but at the same time, I think countries are cautious because they know that until there's a track record, things can snap back. And then, of course, We can add additional sanctions to what we already have. And then, of course, there's always the military option. And to the point that my colleagues made earlier, part of the reason this diplomacy worked is because there was force in service of diplomacy. The President of the United States had commissioned a weapon that could penetrate the underground nuclear site that Iran had created called Fordo, and had commissioned it, gotten the Congress to help pay for it, had tested it and had deployed it, and had rearranged our forces in the theater so Iran knew we were serious. So military force is critical to diplomacy. It does set the table, as the chairman said, to be able to try to accomplish diplomacy. So I think we are in a very good position here, but I want everybody to be clear, this has nothing to do with trust.
I might just mention before I ask the others to comment, on the weapon that we had designed to go after Fordo and penetrate, we developed that weapon, as you're right, and we tested it. And as a matter of fact, when Israel was threatening to attack Iran, I sat down with the defense minister and showed him, the fact that we had that weapon, and I think it played a role in convincing them to kind of hold back from what had occurred. Mike, your comments on
this is the Jerry Springer moment. And then before I give my opinion on it, I do think that Americans can be proud. We did have meetings in classified sessions leading up to all of this, and there were impassioned debates, which I would hope we would all want to happen, because it had to happen in a classified session. You don't want everybody nodding and agreeing on something as serious as the Iran deal, saying, yeah, we all ought to just get along, let's do it. There were, I thought, good questions, challenges, impassioned moments. And
I loved every moment.
Yeah, almost every moment you loved. But I will tell you this, you have one of the best, most qualified diplomats to serve in that capacity, who was there and a part of it. Now, I disagreed with the way it came out and some of the details of it, but I do not disagree with the people that we had leading this fight. That's, to me, is the important part about disagreeing on political issues moving forward on national security. You have to have those discussions. There's going to be disagreements, but it wasn't the qualifications of the people who were engaged in this, and I compliment you for that. Okay, now.
Now that the pleasantries are over.
The pleasantries are over.
With all due respect.
With all due respect. I had a lot of concerns about the way it was unraveling. And again, I'm not telling a tale out of school. We've had these discussions, honestly. And by the way, it was never not civil. I think that's very important for people to understand. We just had passionate differences of opinion. And so I'll tell you how I first heard about the first round of negotiations. A foreign nation state contacted me and said, did you know that your government is meeting in a third nation with the Iranians? Now, I'm the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. And I said, excuse me? I had to hang up the phone, as Leon would know how this would work. And those are never pleasant calls to have or to get, I imagine, to get that straightened out. I thought that was poor form. And what it told me is not because it hurt my feelings, that you had foreign nation states who now thought something's going on that makes me very uncomfortable, and why am I not included in it? I thought that was the first, largest, biggest mistake going into these negotiations. And then secondly, guys like me had issues, and by the way, this was bipartisan. It certainly was leading up to the agreement. There were just people who look at this for a long time, too, who said, hey, there's some really significant challenges here to get over. One is if you continue to narrow the field on what is in the negotiations, you will leave open all of these proxy fights that will lead to mistrust for our Arab League partners. And I think it's hard to disagree that some of that certainly led through and causes problems now that we have trying to get them back on other issues. Now, some may argue it was worth that consternation for them. Some would argue it's not. I argue maybe not. And so now you have these countries making decisions, which is all the things we talked about, that I don't think are healthy for the future of the country, including buying nuclear weapons, talking about buying nuclear weapons, talking about creating nuclear programs of their own. Egypt has had the discussion. Jordan signed a deal with, I think, South Koreans on a deal. The Egyptians signed a deal with the Russians. So now you have exactly what people like me were afraid of. You've created this whole monster. I'm not sure how we get back in. And I wasn't sure exactly the deal did exactly what we needed. And my argument with the snapback provisions is why I don't think it is. There's a provision in the agreement that says if you do a contract that's not related to the nuclear program, that contract has to be fulfilled. Now, it may be a day and a half in the contract. It could be 2 years of the contract, which is exactly why Boeing just announced that they're interested in doing a deal with Iran. Trust me, they're not going to go into Iran and do a deal on airplanes if there isn't some fulfillment of that contract. There's no way they're going to do that.
That's actually not accurate.
No, it is accurate. This is how we got into this process. And this was the big fight publicly, that it wasn't accurate. The language is very clear in the bill. And so how I think it got misinterpreted was because it had to be related to the nuclear program. Well, the problem is there are lots of contracts not related to the nuclear program. Matter of fact, the Germans, you couldn't buy a plane ticket when this deal got signed between Berlin and Tehran. And most of it was filled, I'm a Michigan guy, we know these things, and an intelligence guy, about auto parts. Boy, they could, and God bless them, right? I'm for a free and open market. But it was all about to try to get those contracts done as fast as they could. The gold rush was on, and none of that was factored in, that 150 billion. Some people said 50 billion. Some people said 80 billion. None of this was factored in the economic growth of Iran. You know, but this is my point. The administration would say 50 billion, but hear me out. You had your turn. This is that fight we had in the chamber. But let me just.
I got a few other issues.
I know, but this is important. I mean, this is important.
All right, make the points.
That economic growth beyond that 50 billion is nearly impossible to put back. Now they have cash in which to operate in Yemen, and this is what our Arab League partners tell us. So it's not that any day that you can stop nuclear anything is a good day, and there are some good things and good provisions in the bill. I thought when you took the total weight of what they didn't get versus what they did get, including the notion that they just tested missile systems, which are incredibly dangerous, and we don't really have a way to look at. We have no real leverage on the missile systems part right now. I argued if you take the whole weight of it, wasn't the right decision for us at this time. So I think it's an honest disagreement. I think folks will fall on both sides.
You get 30 seconds.
Right. I'm not going to go into all the disagreements, including on the missiles piece, but just for any Boeing out there or anyone else who wants to do business within the very small limits the U.S. has, because the U.S. still has a primary embargo, unlike our European partners. If Boeing does a contract and an entity with which it does the contract is redesignated when we snap back the sanctions, they have to pull out of the contract. They have to leave, and they have to unwind it. So that is just sine qua non.
If we debate this, that tells you there's a flaw in the agreement.
Our lawyers won't debate it at all.
And our lawyers said
right.
the other side. That's why you have two sets of lawyers.
Let me move on. Ray, you want to comment? You want to get into this too?
No.
Welcome.
I want to make another point, actually. First, I would say the Joint Chiefs really were not involved in the details of the agreement, which we have no issue with. But what I would say was a couple things. Is one, we view it as any nation without a nuclear weapon is a positive thing, and especially since a nation such as Iran with a nuclear weapon becomes very dangerous because their calculation to use it could be very different than a nation such as Russia, China, the United States. The second point I'd make, and the last point I'd make, is we should not confuse this with any freezing of hostilities between Iran and the United States. Iran continues to do an incredible amount of nefarious things around the world, and this does not mean we are now best friends with Iran. This is just one small piece, an important piece of trying to help them from gaining a nuclear weapon, and we should not forget all the other things that they are involved with, which is direct action in some cases against U.S. entities around the world.
Let's deal with the other rogue state right now, North Korea. This is a question on Kim Jong-un, which is making threats, and it seems like no one is taking him seriously. But what if he does do something Is the American government ready for such an attack?
Well, I would say this. My fear is the unstable nature of Kim Jong-un. Nobody really knows who he is. And I worry that his actions and chances of miscalculation grow by the minute. We've heard threats from North Korea before, but not like these and not from this individual. So obviously there's great concern that he could do something that could quickly escalate into something that nobody wants. And, you know, if he develops a tactical nuclear weapon or even a regional nuclear weapon, and again, this applies to him double than it probably does to Iran, the potential for him to use that is probably much greater than the rest of these nations. And so if that happens, the potential for chaos will escalate quite quickly. I just remind everybody that within South Korea, there are probably hundreds of thousands of Americans, some military, some civilian, and the American population would be very much affected if it was used against South Korea. And then you have this potential to create this level of instability in a region that's very important economically to all of us. So it's really important that we try to keep this issue from escalating. And so it's important that we work with China to ensure this does not escalate beyond what we think it should. And, you know, I worry because, and there might be a difference of opinion, China used to have more control, I believe, over North Korea than they do now. Doesn't mean they don't have control. They have economic levers. But I worry that they don't have the control they once had. So I just think we have to take these threats seriously, because if we don't, it could cause chaos. And so it's important for us that if they launch an invasion, it's too late. So we've got to, you know, what we have to do is deter them. We have to make sure they understand that if they do something, it's going to cost them. And it's got to be more than just the U.S. Trying to deter them from making a huge miscalculation.
Okay, let's turn to another interesting player in the world, Russia. Putin's Russia has been much more aggressive of late in annexing Crimea and in continuing disruption in the Ukraine. In addition, they deployed forces, as we know, to Syria. How does the United States draw the line on Putin?
You know, he made a really interesting calculation about, I'm going to guess, 8-9 years ago. He made a really interesting foreign policy speech where he outlined a lot of the things he wanted to accomplish in his foreign policy objectives. One was to make sure Georgia, the country of Georgia, did not get into NATO. The second was Ukraine didn't get into NATO, that he reasserted some influence in former Soviet bloc countries, that he reasserted himself on the national stage, and he did that by plopping in some really sophisticated nuclear submarines that give us all pause. And the last was he was going to push back on missile defense for the United States. If you know, sometimes we always say that the Russians look like us, but they don't think like us. And so sometimes I think we misinterpret where they're going with this. And if you look at what he could say to his parliament today is that they occupy 20% of the country of Georgia today, and they have refortified militarily. They're sending some of their best new equipment to fortify that 20%, South Ossetia being one of it. They fundamentally changed the battlefield by using cyber as a preparation of the battlefield in a way we hadn't really seen before 2008. That now fundamentally changes the way we look at cyber in our national defense and security posture, including how we use it in an offensive capacity. Ukraine, I think Crimea was, just a treat. I don't think he really planned on Crimea. The way it unfolded, I think, was an opportunity for him. There were missile engine plants along that eastern border area of Ukraine and Russia that produced all of their engines for their ICBMs. Guess where those are today, right? Those are back firmly under control of Vladimir Putin. I don't even think he wants Ukraine. I mean, maybe you have a difference of opinion. I really don't. I think he just wants to disrupt it enough that it isn't going to NATO. So they've announced that Georgia's not coming into NATO. They've announced that there's been no official announcement, but Ukraine is not even close to meeting the minimum standards now to get into NATO. He looks at this as, I'm winning, and now I'm a big player in Syria. I'm winning, right? I mean, his economy is falling apart, as you said, very, very aptly. But he thinks he's winning, and his population is going through the roof, and he's having a lot of fun. He's re-engaging. He just did a Russian bomber down the English Channel. They turned off all of their transponders and flew it down the English Channel, caused, as you can imagine, all kinds of hectic chaos. He ran a bomber down the west coast of California. We hadn't seen this kind of behavior since really the late 80s. This aggressive. They've been doing huge operations in the Arctic, and I thought this was interesting. This tells me a lot about Putin. We announced in July that we were going to talk about cutting 40,000 Army troops from our service ranks. About 3 months later, he announces he's going to do an exercise with 40,000 troops in the Arctic. Right? I'm sure it may have been a coincidence. I don't know. I'm an FBI guy. I'm not sure I buy it. He's very clever, and he was sending a clear message. And by the way, he did do this huge operation in the Arctic, and he's trying to lay claim into the Arctic. I just think this is his time.
So how do we send a signal to Putin that he can't just do anything he wants in the world?
So I think his move's a bit more calculated. If you read his speeches from 4 or 5, maybe 6, 7 years ago, he says that the Cold War ended in the wrong way, and that he has to regain some of the losses that the Russia suffered in the Cold War, Soviet Union. And what he's talking about, then he'll say that the U.S. and EU did not keep their promises economically to the Russian people, and that's why the Russian economy is failing. He then said they promised they wouldn't move into Eastern European countries. They've now become part of NATO. We've got to regain the protection of countries around Russia in order to assert Russian influence and our proud heritage. And he's built a nationalist fervor that has allowed him now to make some moves. Georgia, Ukraine. So what I worry is the next move is that he's going to challenge a small NATO country. Because I believe what he would really like to do is potentially attack NATO and let NATO disintegrate in front of his eyes. And the way to do that is you go into Latvia, Lithuania, pick your small country, and NATO, which is supposed to, under Article 5, respond, does not respond. And then NATO falls apart. So whether he's going to do this or not, I can't tell you. But I believe running a bomber down the English Channel, running a bomber off the coast, he's testing to see what reactions he gets from the United States and from NATO. So I believe in order to stop him, we need, and oh, by the way, why this is all going on, we are significantly decreasing our presence in Europe. NATO has stopped over the last 10 years investing in their military in Europe. So the response needs to be a reinvestment in capability in Europe. We are rotating more. The U.S. Army and Air Force is rotating more forces into Europe, but I think there's more that has to be done slowly over time to reassert our position in Europe, and that we will, in fact, not allow him to go into a NATO country. We have to continue to encourage forcefully investment by our NATO allies in defense. The agreement is you're supposed to put 2% of your GDP in defense. And as far as we know, France is meeting it, and now the UK maybe is meeting it.
And Poland.
And Poland, yeah. And that's it. And so we've got to reassert, we lead NATO, we have to reassert ourselves, and we have to make sure that we continue to put pressure on him so he does not overreach, which could cause a significant issue inside of Europe. And so, some of the European, and I believe some of the Europeans are hesitating because he does control gas that goes into Europe, natural gas. And so some countries are hesitant to act, and we have to just work our way through that. And so this, I believe, is important. And I think now that his leadership, that they will say, and I don't agree with it, he is showing now in the Middle East, is now adding to this idea that Russia is once again growing, and so I worry about that. And I'll just make one comment that they did surprise us with their military operations inside of the Ukraine. How quickly they were able to move, how sophisticated they were in managing cyber integrated with conventional operations. They've done it in a way that we had not seen anyone else do. And so they have been investing in this. They've been retraining their military. And so all I'm saying is there's great caution that has to be taken, and we have to take this very seriously.
Wendy, let's take the same approach now, looking at China and what China's doing in the South China Sea. They've now, I mean, obviously we knew they asserted sovereignty over the South China Sea. They've now built these islands. They are militarizing these islands with missiles and fighter planes, et cetera, and basically, militarizing the South China Sea. What do we do to check them in terms of...
They are militarizing the South China Sea. They're also trying to create economic supremacy in the South China Sea. They long ago set out a doctrine called the 9.9 line, which basically created economic zones around all of these islands and all of these pieces of territory that they are now claiming is theirs so that they control commerce. And it's the control of commerce that is really fundamentally what is here. Absolutely, we're concerned about the military bases doing airstrips, their ability to project power in those ways and to have those different outlets. But this is fundamentally also an economic strategy on China's part to control commerce. We can't allow that to happen. Most of the commerce of the largest share of the commerce of the world goes through the South China Sea. So we can't allow that to occur. We have worked hard to try to get a code of conduct among the South Asian nations about how you should interpret the law of the sea and what is possible. We have to stare them down when they do things that they should not, and I thought it was great that we sent some of our fine military to just hover over an island to say, we're watching, we see, we're not going to stand back, we're going to do what we need to do, we'll take action when we need to take action. We've told countries that we don't get in the middle of territorial disputes, but at the same time we have to call out China and we have to take action. I think in both of these instances, China, which is trying to test our leadership, and Russia is most certainly trying to test our leadership, and I associate myself strongly with both my colleagues, but particularly what General Odierno said about what Putin is testing here where NATO is concerned and our forces in Europe and our missile defense capabilities in Europe. The United States has to use our military tactically as well as strategically in these situations to not draw lines in the way of, we're going to start a war if you do this, but rather to say, we see what you're doing, we're going to call you out for what you're doing. We are going to work with other countries in the region to make sure that we all take the actions that are necessary to make sure that there's freedom of navigation in the seas. Critical.
Mike, a question from the audience. What actions would the United States take in the case of a massive cyber attack?
Well, the question is, I don't think we really know. And so here's and that's part of the problem, right? The policy has been muddled. We are the only nation, about 85% of our networks in America are private sector networks. Contrary to popular belief, they're not monitored by the NSA. You snicker because you think that is or not? The conspiracy theorists, please see me, outdoor rights. This is a huge problem for us, because if we even decide that we're going to respond, we're going to go and flick somebody in the forehead with cyber capability. And by the way, this is not a capability problem. That is the least of our problems. It's that if we do that, they're not going to come back at the Defense Department or NSA or the CIA. They're going to go find some company somewhere that is minding their own business in the United States that is highly integrated and will take them off the grid. And we've seen that with North Korea in Sony. That was a nation state attacked an American company. And if you think about it, what could we do? How did we respond to that? Iran attacked a great American company, the Sands Resort Casino. I'm sure you've left some money there. Some of you, at least this section over here, I've seen you there. You think about that, they took their time. It was absolutely to punish the CEO for a political position he took in the continental United States. and according to public reports, was able to get about $40 million worth of damage to his company in a weekend. A nation state attacked an American company. I don't know if there's other examples of this. We've watched Russia go into Germany and go after these big blaster steel-making plants and turn down, they're called SCADA systems, turn them off so that they couldn't control the heat of these blasters, which is really dangerous stuff. Very dangerous. We just watched Russia use its nation-state cyber attack in Ukraine to shut down the electric grid. Now, the interesting thing about Ukraine is they're not nearly as well connected. They were able to shut off the power. They got their power up in about 2 days because they went and, like an old lawnmower, pulled them started again, right? They just went and sent people to the substations and turned them back on. They weren't connected to the internet. We looked at that and said, you know what, Houston, we have a problem. If they did the same thing to us, you wouldn't have power for a month, 45 days, 6 months. And so here's the problem with the massive cyber attack. It will probably take that to wake up Congress and the American people as to what the threats are. But I'm not sure at the response time, we don't have a good kind of threat matrix and then how we respond in kind matrix on a scale of, do you send a missile for a cyber attack? Do you do a cyber attack for a cyber attack? Do you maneuver? I mean, what is our diplomatic options? They're not great when it comes to cyber, and we really haven't figured it out as a nation, which is really should scare the hell out of all of you.
Can I just add one point to this?
Drink carts. Yeah. This is one of the drink carts.
One point to this. We do have capabilities. We do have capabilities, because I think people need to know the other side of this story. We do have capabilities to counter some of the cyber warfare, and we also have to be very, very thoughtful about our offensive capabilities, because if you start a cyber war, it can easily go out of control. And I'll use something that was in the New York Times without affirming it, and that was Stuxnet, which was used by someone in Iran, which had an impact, but also got into the malware system beyond Iran. So this is a very complicated, very difficult. The chairman has done an enormous amount of work on this, as has General Odierno, because you can't be in the military without beginning to think about cyber command. And needless to say, the Secretary of Defense has been very engaged in this. As I said, staggering hours have been spent in the Situation Room trying to think through all of these eventualities. It is very tough. We are good at what we do. We are very good at what we do, but this keeps on growing in everybody's capacity, and so staying ahead of it is very tough.
If I could just make one point. If I was a citizen, I am, but if I was you as well.
I am. Is there something you'd like to tell us?
Tell us. Yeah.
The general was born in Canada.
I'm so used to wearing a uniform. I consider ourselves not. I don't know if I don't consider ourselves citizens or what.
We do. We consider you a U.S. citizen.
You should demand better public-private partnership on cyber, and sharing of information and sharing of capabilities. That's the problem we have now, and we need legislation and other things that will help us do a much better effort in protecting our infrastructure through private-public partnerships. And I think the military is more than willing and ready to help and provide capabilities and share information, but it's important that we start thinking about this and writing the laws necessary for us to do this to protect our infrastructure. Because I agree with this is one of the most complex and likely threats that we face. And what's even scarier to me is it's not expensive to develop it. So I worry about ISIS and Al-Qaeda and everybody else developing a capability that could have significant impacts.
And I just want to say this.
No.
Wait a minute. It's not because there is incompetence in dealing with it. The problem is so complex because we are so connected to the internet like no other nation on the face of the earth. That's the problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, we could have gone on for another 3 hours talking about these issues. The whole purpose of this is to give you a feel for the challenges that are out there. We're hearing a lot during the campaign about what presidents want to do. Some of it's sane, some of it's insane. But the reality is that it is the people of this country that will really, in the end, determine whether we are an America in renaissance or an America in decline. That's the purpose of what this lecture series is all about. I thank you very much for coming this evening.
Thanks. See, we got that out of the way. We had to have it. We had to happen. Thanks, brother.
Good to see you.